Blood had drained the snow to the color of iron, a thin stain beneath a face half buried where the drift had offered what shelter it could, and then betrayed her to the cold. The wind had the brittle voice of the high plain, a voice that spoke in sharp flurries and in the still white hush between gusts. It was under that hush that Yates Ingram found her. He had been tracking farther than he'd meant to, following a buck that had cut a wide arc along the ridge and down toward a stand of pines. The trail of the animal had led him through a pocket of prairie that held a spill of white so pure it looked almost wrong against the rust-browned skeletons of sage. He tied Thunder to a scrub cedar and moved on foot because snow muffled the world and a man can move quieter without metal and leather clanking. He'd carried his rifle because winter had teeth and men did not go without their weapons out here. He kept a shorter rope of reins and a pouch of dried meat. He did not mean to find a woman. He meant, at most, to find the elk and to put a clean bullet into it. Instead, his boot broke crust and the ground caved under him. He slid a hand and found hair, dark as old leather, a forehead chilled to ice. He smelled iron and something else, whiskey perhaps, or the sharp tang of gunpowder, and his first thought, more reflex than mercy, was that she had been in company with violence. He checked for a pulse because that is the first truth a man learns in a country that kills without malice. Life is either here or it is not. There, under a throat rimed with frost, a faint flutter answered his fingers, arrhythmia like a moth beating against a pane. He cupped her face and listened for breath. She breathed once, shallow and small, then again. He had seen too many dead, and not enough mornings in a single life to mistake a breathing body for anything but trouble and blessing. He rolled her onto his shoulder the way a man carries a sack, and the woman came awake on the march like a shipwrecked thing blinking at day. Her eyes were the dull green of winter pond water. They fixed on him with a half question, and then slid away as if ashamed of asking anything at all. "Stay with me," Yates told her, more command than invitation. He could not know how many hours she had lain there. The frost had worked into the weave of her skirts, but the girl's coat, coarse wool, plain cut, had been a good one once, and it had kept her from turning to stone. He wrapped her in his own blanket, the one he kept at the saddle for nights too bitter to sleep under the stars, and she clung to it the way the dying cling to any warm thing. Thunder snorted and pawed, a horse made tense by cold and by the sight of a woman bundled over a man's shoulder. Horses understand danger by instinct, they know the human weight of it. Yates laid her across the saddle behind him and rode hard, the horse's breath steaming, hooves ringing against frozen ground that had a glass sheen. Snow shaved the horse's flanks, and the wind lifted the man's scarf into a small flag of flayed red. He got her to his cabin in time, because time in those days was not a measurement, but a currency, and Yates spent what he had. The cabin was squat and honest, sunk low-shouldered into the hill, built of logs darkened by smoke and years. A single window looked out to the pine stand, and to a horizon that cut like a blade. He lifted her onto the table and set to work with the sure, brutal, careful hands of a man who had stitched the rank wounds of men who never made it back to town. The wound in her side was not a neat bullet hole. It was ragged and full of the roughness of a fight and the bluntness of a misspent life. She had lost enough blood to make the margin between living and dead narrow. Yates poured whiskey into a tin cup and did not offer a sip to himself. The liquor served as antiseptic and as a way to steel himself against the things he had to do. He cut cloth from a spare shirt, threaded gut to stiffen a needle, and set about closing what he could. It was crude surgery, and a man who had learned such things under cavalry tents and on the trail knows the price of hesitation. The needle scraped her breath into a thin rasp. She made a sound like prayer and then like a curse. Once he had secured the wound as well as he could, he warmed the cabin with fire and set her by it, wrapping hot stones in a blanket and setting them at her feet. He propped a tin mug of coffee near her lips and massaged her hands until color came back to the tips. Night crept in along with the cold, and the cabin settled, wood exhaling the day's heat. Yates had no kin to keep watch for him. His company had been the land and thunder and the memory of the army. But that night he sat until dawn, a single kerosene lamp between them, and when her breath changed, he hummed a song he had learned as a boy. It was a thing to tether the soul to a voice. He kept vigil with his chin propped on his fist and with the rifle across his knees, an old habit that came from patrols and from the necessity of being ready in a day when a man might be glad of something as ugly as a gun. When she dreamed, she murmured things of a stagecoach and passengers, of men with rough faces and hands that found pockets as if they were tool belts for taking life. Her words came in fragments, names of counties, a faint reference to a locket, the smell of tobacco and horses. He listened and stitched and listened again until the lamplight thinned into dawn. He had seen 100 ways for a life to end, frozen, starved, trampled, ridden into by drunken men seeking sport, and this one felt like a thin mercy. He did not know her name. He did not ask beyond a rough, "What's your name?" pressed like the edge of a question into the air. "Margaret," she said, but the syllable left her as if it were not a claim so much as a memory. "Maggie," she added, as though comforting herself. "All right, Maggie," he told her. "You're safe here." The cabin smelled then of stew and of burned cordwood. He fed a pan on the hearth until the meat softened and gave up its flavor. She ate with hands that trembled, but she ate. Food rebuilds broken things as surely as a stitch. Heat followed. Color returned in waves that took time to be trusted. He learned how she had been traveling for Jerome, a town a day's hard ride to the south. Though, like so many things in that country, distance was a pliant truth. She had been going to see her uncle Elias, to lay claim to a homestead, or to take up a small job. The particulars blurred where trauma had come. She had been on a stagecoach that had been held up outside of an out-of-the-way pass. Men had taken the mail and the passengers' possessions. Violence had followed. She had run. The last thing she remembered, before the snow and the cold had claimed her, was falling, and the flash of a man's shadow above her, the biting of wind, the sudden bitterness of blood. Yates listened for long moments before he spoke of the men. He knew the names that rustled like scrub grass in a town's gossip. Dixon's gang ahead of the Washita. Pete, who would do anything for a coin. The sort of men who thought a woman as small as a purse. He kept his observations short. Where talk gives consent, silence binds a man. He had been a scout for the cavalry once, and his memory of those days had the same edge as an old knife. "You were near the ridge," he said. "They likely took the coach a mile past the pines. They move south if they move at all. They'll be after anything left behind." She closed her eyes at that and turned her face to the heat. "I had a locket," she said, not looking at him. "My mother's. The words faltered like a horse on ice. "It fell from my neck when I ran." Yates's hands, scarred knuckles and calloused palms, went still on the edge of the table. A locket is not the most precious thing in a woman's life, but in a country where pedigree and memory are the coins that buy a future, a locket can be a map. He did not promise to retrieve it. He promised instead to keep her alive. He wrapped bandages with the sort of tenderness a man reserves for things that could not speak. When night came again, the cabin hummed with the small sounds of tending, the rasp of cloth, the clink of tin, thunder's clicks against the doorframe. He slept in a chair, one boot propped to steady himself, but he did not leave her side. When she finally stood, and her legs remembered walking like a thought rediscovered, he taught her how to fetch water without letting cold bite the skin, how to keep stew from burning in the kind of hearth that ate iron and spit sparks for sport. He showed her where the extra blankets were, and how to pull them down without waking a man who had learned to sleep at odd hours. They worked at the country's odd intimacy, shared chores, shared silences. He taught her the rhythm of a rifle. She taught him the soft ways of speech he had not used since mustering out of the army. "You're a good healer," she said one evening, when the cabin smelled of baking bread, and the winter wind complained at the eaves. She had started making bread because the act of kneading was a mercy she could give herself. Dough took shape under her palms, and the cabin took on the domestic shape of two people who had to live together as if it were not an oddness but a necessity. "It's what needs doing," Yates answered. He watched her with an expression that was not pity. It was something older and fiercer. "Besides, a man ought to know how to sew a wound. Keeps a body from wasting away." "Does it keep the soul from wasting away too?" she asked, voice light as flour. He shrugged one shoulder, a motion that said he did not know, and then told her a story from his cavalry days about a captain who would, against orders, send food to an Indian camp that had been raided. The men had laughed at him, but that captain's reputation stayed intact because he had a heart heavy enough to do what was hard. Yates liked that story because it explained him more than he could with words. They fell into a pattern: work, tending, reading from a single battered Bible by lamplight, sometimes speaking and sometimes letting the hearth mutter like a neighbor. He carved small things in idle hours, checkers out of spare wood, a cold-weather whistle shaped to fit a man's call to his dog. She read to him in the long afternoons when the snow outside made the world soft as cotton. Her voice, first thin from fever, grew steadier, was like a thread mending a torn seam. She read letters she had with her, the cramped handwriting of an uncle who loved a simple truth, and the two of them, in a cabin that smelled of bread and wood smoke, began to stitch the space between two people who had been strangers. Days passed like a second season. The sky lightened earlier, the snow outside settled into patterns of wind-sculpted dunes, and the work of keeping life steady made ordinary things precious. The smallness of the cabin tightened them together. She taught him a game of words she had learned as a child, and he taught her how to gut a rabbit without wasting the sinew. She learned the names of the herbs he kept in a wooden drawer, and the places in his past that he gave like tokens, an award ribbon turned rag, the singed corner of his blanket. He trusted her with a story whose telling made his jaw tighten. His time as a scout under a captain who had been too daring for army life. A night when a column had been surprised and he'd had to lead men through a river of black. The story was not one of heroism so much as of necessity. It showed him to be a man who had done what had to be done and had not asked for laurels. They began to notice, in small ways, how the other's presence rearranged the cabin's geometry. A mug left on the sill became not an accident, but a proof of someone else. An extra plate at meals was a quiet invitation. When he rose before dawn to check traps or to tend a fence post, he would find a note in the firewood stack. Taken a walk. Back before noon. Her handwriting had a tilt to it that put the word home into the room. The past did not stay silenced. Fever dreams visited her in the deep of night and left shards against her waking mind. A face by candlelight demanding the mailbag, hands rifling through trunks, a man named Pete who had smiled without mirth. She would wake and press fingers to the place above her heart where her neck had been bruised, and the cabin would hold its breath. He would sit with his head against the doorframe and listen to the creak of the logs as if they were telling him to be wary. He rode out sometimes, thin as the day allowed. Food and mail came rarely to that ridge. A man must keep stores and know how to trade. When he went, he left explicit instructions, and she would stand at the window until his dark shape in the distance was only a dot. The cold made the world clear, horizons were sharper, and the mind could see the lay of the land with a cruelty that left no illusions. On one return in late afternoon, the sky bruised purple and red, Yates found tracks near the door. Not the tracks of game, but of boots and of men who had made a circuit once around the cabin and then gone south. The prints were not numerous, and they were not fresh, but they set his jaw like a trap. "How many?" she asked, coming from the shadow of the hearth like a woman with both hands empty. "Not many," he said. "Enough." He did not panic. Panic is a luxury of those who expect to be taken care of. He made preparations with the same steady hand that greased a hinge or put an extra strip of canvas beneath a saddle. He taught her how to make a fire that would not smoke too much, how to move shadows in a room so that a person might seem less easy to find. She learned to sit very still and to breathe in measures that did not attract attention. He checked their single rifle together and showed her how to hold it so that it felt part of her arm. That night, he sat with the rifle until the moon slid down the face of the pines. They listened for the creak of a horse and for the false stillness that always precedes bad men. He told her stories aloud, deliberately, to keep his voice steady. Tales of soldiers who survived ambushes by being dull, of a mule that once saved a unit when it refused to cross a certain hollow because it smelled wrong. Humor is an armor as simple as any. When the hour came that men might be most likely to show themselves, a sound outside made the cabin fold inward, the tense scrape of one boot, then another. A shadow against the grove of pines. Yates slid the bolt on the door and crouched where lantern light would not catch him. He did not want to shoot if he could help it. Men who overuse their fists of lead make enemies that last beyond a lifetime, but he would not let his home be taken. A figure approached the door and tapped once, then twice, an odd formality for such men. Yates kept silent. The knocking stopped. A voice muffled by the wind called, "Friend, is there room to warm and trade a bit of news?" Without thinking, Yates answered, his voice flat and small for the space it occupied. A man's always welcome for a bit of food and shelter, if he's got coin and reason to be decent. The answer sounded fair. Men will speak fair when they mean otherwise, only fools depend on the sound of words. The shadow receded and the wind took away talk. The men left tracks that a careful eye could note for direction. Yates marked them with a twig bent at an angle in the earth, a small code he had learned to leave for himself in places he might return. When the night had stretched itself like a long animal and then slunk away to dawn, he reported the visit to no one because there was no one to report it to. She asked if he wanted him to ride in for help. He answered with a small crooked smile, "Who'd mind the store?" "Who'd mind the store where there are no stores?" she said, but she laughed, and there was relief in the sound, like a bird unpracticed in flight. He left 2 days later with a soft sealed satchel of coins and a list of what to get: coffee, salt, flour, and if he could, a letter sent to Uncle Elias in Jerome to tell him Margaret was alive. He told her he would be gone no more than a day, though he hedged because the country keeps no clocks but those of daylight and of luck. Before he went, he paused at the doorway and looked back. He saw her standing by the hearth, a shawl around her shoulders, the locket's absence, a small hollow of missing metal at her throat. He had learned to read the shape of need in people, the way they favor a limb that hurts, the way their hands find a pocket or a seam for reassurance. For reasons that had more to do with something like conscience than with charity, he put his hand against the wood of the doorframe and said, "If anything comes by and you're not safe, you fire once toward the north. It will bring me back." She looked up at him with eyes that had been hollowed by the night's cold and the passage of men. "If you don't come back," she began, because their stay together had not erased the map of loss that lay within her. "Then you send a smoke to the pines," he said, and meant the half-breath of a joke. He slid his rifle into the scabbard and mounted Thunder. The horse's ears twitched when he moved, the animal tuned to his touch as if it knew its man could not be replaced easily. He rode with the sun at his back and the promise of return in his pocket. The land opened and shut like a book. He passed a dry coulee where rabbits ran, and he topped a ridge and saw the long scatter of Jerome in the valley like a child's patchwork. He did not like the look of men in the trading post that day. Faces were watchful, and hands lingered too long under coats. A man hiding something or expecting to see someone he's owed a worry about. He traded what he could, and bought flour and coffee and a small packet of sewing needles. He took a letter from his saddle pouch and delivered it to a postman who scowled, but who accepted the coin. He shouldered saddlebags and turned them with the practiced motion of a man who had wrought many such routines. On the return, the sky darkened faster than it should have, a storm pushing down from the west with a weather that changed the land as if a hand had thrown a sheet over it. He rode harder. Halfway down the last slope, he saw prints in the snow near a clump of scrub, the distinct mark of a boot, and close to it, a small glint that meant a metal object had been dropped. He rained thunder and slid to the snow. The glint was a locket, but not hers. No, the engraving was different. Men had rifled pockets in the snow. Something told him they had been here and had been hurried. The sky closed in, and the wind took up like a band playing the end of a funeral. He tore his horse to a pace he seldom used within the settlement, and rode as if the earth itself needed his speed. The hour between light and dark stretched thin. He worried, not like a man hoping for rescue, but like a man who had perhaps made a promise he must keep. When he came to his cabin, the wind had driven drifts almost to the sill. He slid from Thunder and kicked at the snow, a man's impatience with nature's adjustments. The door was latched where he had left it. Marks on the earth outside showed where men had walked in a circle, as if picking at something in the dark and then taking their leaves. He pushed inside and found the inner air warm, the hearth still glowing, the bread risen and set in a bowl on the table. She wasn't at the house. Panic is a thing you let yourself feel, and then you measure it. Yates's mind counted steps. Where had she gone? He looked at the window and saw that a scarf had been left in the chair. A chair sat empty. The cottage felt too large for one person again. He ran his hand over the table and found a note, folded neat as a gift. In her handwriting, small and careful, it said, "Gone to look for the ridge tracks. If I can find the locket, I'll be back at dusk. M." His chest eased in a way that was less relief than a reweaving of worry into action. He should not have been surprised. Margaret had a stubbornness in her that did not wait for a man to tell her what to do. He grabbed his coat, slung his rifle, and followed her tracks into a world that had gone to gray. He found her a mile out, bent beneath the weight of a small storm, combing the snow with a stick like a woman looking for a lost thing that held more than metal. She turned when he came near, mouth tight with the cold, cheeks like apple halves. She nodded at him, as if she had known he would come. "You said fire if I needed you," she told him. "You didn't expect me to come out like this." "Didn't expect either is the same as still expecting," he said. He knelt and set his rifle down and took the stick from her hand, and tapped a spot where the snow had been disturbed, and found small, ragged slashes, evidence of a scuffle. He felt anger, a light, hot thing that did not hurt the land but burned him from the inside out. "Was it them?" she asked, voice small as a cracked cup. "They were in the neighborhood," he said, "but they were not here when I came back." She set her hands in her pockets and looked at the sky, as if the weather might answer for the kind of men who broke a stagecoach. "If they take it," she could not finish. The locket held a memory, and the land had a way of taking memories to the weather. "Then we'll take it back," Yates said, and for the first time since finding her in the drift, his voice carried the shape of a vow. "If you love harrowing survival stories and unlikely love, stay with us." They returned to the cabin and spent the evening planning nothing so explicitly as survival routines, and everything as if rehearsing a life: where to hide the gun, how to stack the wood to make a poor man's alarm, which of the two of them would walk with a basket toward Jerome, and which would linger in the cabin to tend the hearth. They ate gruel and dried meat, and set the bread into the pan, and turned their talk to less urgent things. What color of dresses she had favored as a girl, the sort of horse he once rode in a cavalry charge. Those small confidences are the glue in a place where days are not promised. Sleep came to them in odd intervals after that, nap-sized and heavily dreamt. Margaret's mind yielded pieces of the day they had been robbed. A man with a scar running from cheek to ear, a face that seemed ordinary until it smiled and revealed a moral vacancy, a driver with a bruise on his jaw who had tried to bargain with the men, a child's voice that had spoken up and then been hushed. Sometimes in the long dark she would wake, hands on her chest, and say the names of things like prayers. Her father's farm near Lancaster, a sister who had left for Ohio, an uncle whose letters had come every spring. Yates would answer with the story of the captain and the mule and the small stubborn kindnesses that kept men from being monsters. They were not simply two people put together by necessity. They were two lives exposed to one another, and exposure in the cold plain is a faster way to know a person than many polite years in town. She learned that he had been a scout who knew the land like a book's margins. He learned that she could find her way by sun and by the set of a furrow. They argued once about whether it was right to take up his rifle and ride after the Dixon gang if they had possession of the locket. She said their taking it was theft, and theft made men dangerous. He said men who struck without consequence grew worse. The argument ended without resolution because, in truth, there were no tidy answers to the roughest questions. Spring made a slow entrance. The snow dialed back in stages, leaving the land wet and soft. The pines exhaled a resinous breath that smelled like young things pushing up from under the soil. With the thaw came the possibility, brittle but present, of going out on errands, of seeing a face in town, of measuring the world by commerce and not only by survival. The thaw also brought the knowledge that men would be moving, and when men move in those parts, they carry with them the sorts of trouble that seek places without witnesses. One afternoon, while mending a shirt by the light of a window that framed the pines like a painting, Margaret found something at the base of the hearth, a small tarnished bit of metal. It was not the locket. It was a coin, half hidden under an ember. It could have been anything, really, just coin dropped in a scuffle, but to her it was a breadcrumb from a trail, a signal that the men who had put hands on that stagecoach had not vanished. She held it and felt suddenly the strain of living with a shadow you could name. "You ever been married?" Yates asked once, after a long silence in which both of them mended a blanket that had a place of patched elbow. "No," she said. The word did not ache. It made no shape beyond what it was. "I had a promise once from a man who favored easier things than I did. He left for the well and did not come back." "This country takes as much as it gives," Yates observed, and the observation carried no longing resentment. It was a fact. "Then why not leave? Why stay out here?" she asked, because it was a fair question. The land demanded a man be honest about his reasons. He looked at the table and at his hands, and then back to the window where thunder grazed a yard away. "Because I like the way it tells me how to be," he said. "Because out here you answer the world the way you can, and because—" He stopped, as if saying the rest would make it less true. "Because sometimes a man finds something that makes him not want to be alone." She put her needle down and watched him, the air between them making something like a promise. This was not love in the city sense, where declarations can be bought and posted like notices. It was a thing built by tending, by the steady bother of being useful to another human being. Love in this place is a slow kind of arithmetic, two souls adding up to a larger ledger. Word came to them after a week, brought by a rider who had seen men at the ford hauling poor plunder, and who had a way of making his warning sound like friction of a frictionless wheel. "Dixon's Run," the rider said over the table, coffee steaming and hands warming. "They've been bold enough to press a lone trader 2 days down from Jerome." Pete was seen there, grinning like a hog in mud. The name set both their teeth tight. The rider left, as if eager to leave danger to those who could manage it. Margaret, who had mended her last seam because stitches are small projects that keep the hands of a person honest, looked at Yates with a new hard clarity. "If they come for the cabin," she began. "They won't find us easy," Yates said, "but we won't wait to be found. If they mean to take what isn't theirs, we'll make it costly." She looked at him then in a way that said she believed him, and also that she was not a thing to be kept safe behind a man's rifle. "Then let me learn how to use it," she said. "I can aim." He paused, and in that pause, he measured their lives like one measures planks to lay a floor. "If you learn," he said, "you learn to be ready to use it. There's no shame in that. Just know there's a price when bullets sing." "There's a price when a locket is stolen too," she replied. He laughed at her defiance, a thin sound, and then set to teaching her how to shoulder a rifle as if it were part of her coat. He taught her to breathe between the memory and the squeeze, to take slow the way you take a cup of water in the desert. They practiced until her hands stopped shaking, and the mark on the boards where the ball had struck was a small dark star. The lesson was practical and also intimate. To watch a woman learn the pull of a rifle is to see her turn into a sharper thing, and Yates felt both wary and proud. There is no dignity in making a woman small for man's comfort. The true measure of a man is what he does with another's growing strength. The days folded into larger patterns. Matthew the trader, an old fellow with a gravel voice who dealt in feed and stories, came by with a wheelbarrow of goods and a rumor that the gang would be desperate as spring opened. They would want coin, and they would want a message sent by the head of a place that children would remember. The country makes its choices by small cruelties. Yates and Margaret arranged their defense with the sort of thoroughness that is the opposite of panic. They shelved the back window so it would not come loose in a wind. They hid the handful of coins in a place only they knew, and she took to keeping a dish by the door with hot water and a cloth for cleaning hands. The measures were practical, and in them the cabin grew tighter and more like a small nation. On a morning when the sun struck a clean, hard light into the room, she found a thing she had not expected, a letter addressed to her in a handwriting she recognized. Uncle Elias had written, with his small, plain honesty. He'd heard of the robbery, and sent the note in the event that a man took pity. The letter was part consolation and part instruction. "Come to Jerome," he said, "and bring the locket if one could be found. If not," Elias wrote, "we'll make you one as good as another, for blood is family thicker than metal." She read the letter aloud, and Yates listened as if the words were a stone in his palm. It meant something to have a place to go. It meant something else entirely to realize that life could be a ledger where debts are paid with more than coin. They wrote back to Elias in words that were spare and honest. She penned thanks to the uncle she had not seen in years, and told him she would come when the thaw allowed safe roads. The act of writing, of making gestures toward a future beyond the ridge, altered the air. It made the cabin more than shelter. It made it a junction, and yet the valley keeps its debts. A week after the letter, tracks circled the cabin once more, not just prints of men loitering, but the clear passage of riders who had sulked the winds for information. The prints were made by a man who knew not to look like he mattered, and by another who gasped when he should have known better. They came with the smell of tobacco and the hollowness men wear when they expect the world to do as they say. Yates paced with a methodical step that would have been comical in a gentler place. He checked the gun, he checked the traps, he checked the latch on the door. Margaret stood beside him with a rifle slung as if it were a shawl. In the way she set it against her shoulder, you could see a woman who had given herself the ability to aim back the theft of her memory. They prepared, as people in that country do, not with pomp, but with the commitment of those who know their fate is often decided by small things. A rock hidden just so, a grit of sand put to make a hinge not creak. They sharpened knives and stacked the wood where a spark would be easy to manage. They were ready in the way that keeps the heart beatable. Then, just as the weather began its change toward the wild, there came the sound of a wagon, of men moving with the clatter of need. They were not so many as to be a posse, but men need not swarm to make a disaster. Yates put the rifle as if it were his promise to her, and Margaret stood where she could look out a slit in the logs and see the pines move. They moved until the world rearranged into a field of action. Men came like a stain across the white. Voices pitched themselves low, then high, then ragged like broken strings. For a breath that felt like a lifetime, the cabin was hollow. The world outside filled its mouth with noise and threat. And then the door burst open, and then the door burst open. Wood slammed against the wall in a shower of splinters. A gust of wind, and the smell of horse and tobacco and fear flooded the cabin. Men spilled into the small room like shadowed water pouring through a broken dam. Voices barked, low, hungry, the kind that wanted what they had come for plus the satisfaction of taking it, and light from a lamp caught on metal, and on faces that had been worn into scowls by a life of taking without return. Yates had the rifle up before the first man cleared the threshold. He did not think. A man's training takes his mind and shapes it into muscle. The first shot cracked like a branch underfoot and rang against the rafters. A man pitched forward with his hand splayed on a table that had once supported a pan of porridge. He made a sound that was not a cry so much as surprise. The second man lunged for the hearth, pulling a fist toward the tin mug at the table as if that might pay his debts. Margaret moved as Yates had taught her, careful, deliberate, the breath taken between thought and squeeze. The rifle bent in her arms like something familiar. The second shot sang, and the man dropped against the corner of a chair, his head making a dull final sound on the wood. There was no time for horror to bloom. In moments like that, the world reduces to a handful of acts you must do if you are to keep the ones you love. Two of the men went down quickly. Another grabbed for the door and stumbled back outside, swearing under his breath in a language that had less to do with words and more to do with teeth. Footsteps ran, someone cursed, and then there was a hasty retreat over the snow as those not felled by lead took the sensible measure of leaving a place that kept its men ready. One man remained. He stood near the threshold like a thing that had been told to hold a pose and did so. His face was narrower than the others, and his eyes carried the look of a man who had been fortunate at small cruelties. Pete. When Yates stepped out from behind the table, the lamp painted both their faces in the same orange. Pete's hand went slowly to the place at his throat where a locket might be hidden. He did not look like the sort of man who had been willing to kill for profit. He looked like the sort of man who had lived long enough to know he could not face a rifle and expect to keep his life. Hands, Yates said, voice even. Slow. Pete's hands rose, palms outward, and in the dim they flashed something that made Margaret freeze in a place between fear and the relief that comes from recognition. A small oval of metal, dark and dull with winter's grime. That's it, she whispered, because the locket hung from a cord around Pete's neck, and the sight of it made her breath hitch into a place that remembered warm kitchens and a mother's laugh. The man who had been hit by Margaret's shot tried to move, a thin breath escaping him. Yates moved across the room with the quiet weight of a man closing a door. He did not hit Pete. He stepped between him and the way out. Pete's eyes flicked from Yates to Margaret and landed on the wound in the man at the table, and something like shame crossed him. You got no right, Pete said, voice small now, shrunken by the way death had come into the room. Not any more, Yates answered. His hand was steady. Drop it. Pete took the locket from his throat as if it burned and held it out. The metal was scratched, but the engraving was a shallow, careful curve that matched an outline Margaret had described in fevered sleep. For a long second she reached for it as if to touch an old bruise, and when her fingers closed on the chain, it felt like the taking of a compass back into one's palm. "Get out," Yates said to the remaining man who still breathed, and to the others, if any of them lingered in the dark. "And take a good look at what you brought here. If I see you again growing teeth on a thing that isn't yours, I'll find you. You'll have to answer a lot more than me." Pete swallowed. The story that clung to his mouth, excuses, small lies, the way men who live by taking justify the wrongs they do, died in his throat. He ran past the open door into a sky that showed his tracks like a storyline and was gone. They knelt to the fallen men without hurry. Mercy, Yates thought then, was not a thing only for the living. Even in the act of burial a man could give dignity. They wrapped the bodies in a canvas and lowered them into a shallow grave beneath the pines. There was no priest to pronounce words, no town to call for the man who came with authority. Yates and Margaret chose the words themselves. Yates said a short, honest thing he had learned in the army when a comrade had fallen, "May the road be level," and Margaret, with her hand on cold canvas, said a short, "I'm sorry," perhaps for the men they buried, and perhaps for the world that produced them. When they returned to the cabin, the lamplight felt smaller than it had an hour before. Margaret sat with the locket in her lap. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, pressed to a small compartment, was a picture in faded ink, a woman's face, soft with youth and hair tied back with a ribbon. The face looked out like a memory that had kept its shape by will. Margaret pressed the curve of the metal to her lips in a motion of reconciliation and grief. "I should have known better than to go looking," she said, voice thin. The admission came not from shame so much as from the recognition that what she had sought had been wrenched from her by a theft of bodies and chances. "You looked," Yates answered, coming to sit beside her at the table, "and you came back." They wrapped their hands around hot mugs and let the warmth climb their fingers, a small consolation for the night's hard facts. Outside, thunder stamped and blew steam in little clouds, the world unwilling to change its breath even as the lives within it had. Days hashed themselves into a new rhythm after that. The locket, safe again beneath Margaret's blouse and now pinned by a leather strip she had cut from a glove, became a thing she checked more often than she would have admitted. Pete was a name that became a warning used in the cabin, as one might use the name of a bad weather, spoken so one stayed alert. The confrontation tightened something between Yates and Margaret that neither had language for. There was gratitude certainly, and a bewildered sort of love that grows in the fault lines of shared danger. There were also new quieter fears, that the world beyond their cabin would not be content to let two people live in a place that had shown its teeth. That a theft was a signal in the wilderness, a way of saying a place could be picked again. It was then, in a night that smelled of pine sap and rain to come, that Margaret did a thing that surprised Yates with its courage and simplicity. She took a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil, and she wrote a letter to Uncle Elias. "I'll come," she wrote with the slow, deliberate script of someone taking a measure of herself. "After the thaw, I have been through a lot, and all I have left of Mother is this. I will come with it." She folded the paper and left it in the hearth for Yates to see. It was an act that set a direction. It was not yet a plan, but it tethered the world to a place beyond the ridge. The decision to leave the cabin was not sudden. They thought of the way the valley opened into a larger country, and of how her claim, once made, might secure a future. They thought of Jerome, of a town with a trading post, with a post office that moved letters like promises, with an uncle who had loved her from the steady place of kinship and who would not shrug at her need to belong. For both of them the cabin had been an interim. It had been a place of recuperation, of teaching, of the strange commerce that happens when two people save each other's lives. A life together in Jerome would be different. It would require making a public thing of what they had learned behind a locked door. On a morning that belonged to the early unfurling of spring, then, they packed. Thunder carried what could be carried. Yates took the rifle he had not wanted to hang in the house of a man who'd chosen to keep his hands clean. Margaret took the locket and a bundle of clothes that smelled faintly of bread. They left behind the graves and the scarred door, and a place where a man might be tempted to shape himself around solitude. The ride to Jerome was a slow making of acquaintances with each other's habits, the way he hummed when thinking, the places she liked to sit facing the sun. The land between their cabin and Jerome had 1,000 small scenes that stitched them to a country. They passed a widow with a child's cow tethered to a post and found themselves stopping to help mend a fence. They shared a kettle with a passing peddler who told them of a mine 3 days beyond the next ridge and of the kind of gambling that makes men rich for a night and poor for years. They sheltered overnight in an inn where men drank bitter beer and told stories with teeth gone from too much chewing of tobacco and hard living. They crossed a swollen creek where Yates guided Thunder's hooves and Margaret's hands clamped his vest as if to hold the world steady. In travel, as in the cabin, the small acts accumulate into a shape. They learned to share silence that was not solitude but company. They argued once, late at night under a sky smeared with stars, about whether to tell Elias the whole of what had happened or to fold the past down into a neat parcel that would not frighten a relative. "We tell him what matters," Margaret said. "The truth is in how people keep their promises afterward." "Promises," Yates answered, the word a knot in his mouth. "I know what they weigh. I know a promise can keep a man steady when everything else hums wrong." When they crested the last hollow and Jerome lay spread below like a patchwork of roofs and smoke, an hour of town life moved to meet them. The first face they saw in the doorway of the general store was Uncle Elias, an elderly man with a face that had been made private through laughter and worry both. He walked with a wagoner's stead, his arms folded like a man who had built more fences than had been necessary. When Margaret collapsed into his arms the way a child might into a father's, it was the proof that the years of letter writing had been more than ink on paper. He smelled of pipe smoke and leather and the stable, and he did not ask many questions. He held her simply. The wedding that followed was not a spectacle. There was no church choir hired for the day. There was an old preacher who wore his Sunday best the way he wore his prayer, with small, careful pieces. The ceremony was held beneath a low belfry on a sun-silvered afternoon. Friends came from the trading post. Matthew the trader and a woman who threw bread to children were there. People clapped with hard hands and sometimes cried. Yates wore his best coat, one that had seen the saddle but had been brushed clean. Margaret carried the locket at her throat like both talisman and caution. They married with words that were more practical than poetic, promising to share burden and board, to keep each other from ruin and from cold. The years that followed were not a single arc of constant prosperity, nor were they a tale of unending hardship. They opened a small shop on Jerome's main street, a place that sold feed, needles, coffee, and, when business allowed, the odd trinket that made a house feel like a home. Margaret kept an eye on the books while Yates repaired harnesses and helped men with stubborn mules. Children came in time, William, Elizabeth, and then James, each one an answering note to the life that had been saved in winter. Parenthood was a curriculum learned by hands and by heart. Margaret taught sewing to a neighbor's girl and read to boys who might otherwise have spent their hours running loose along the tracks. Yates taught his sons how to read a ridge and how to tie a knot that would not fail when you needed it most. There were fights, town quarrels over land, a barroom dispute that left a man with a bruised eye, but these were the small local violences a town must hold inside itself rather than allow them to become the wide-open wrongs of the world. The Dixon gang's legend receded like a bitter cloud. Pete surfaced once in rumor, said to have been seen hitching a horse 2 counties over, but Yates did not go looking. Mercy, he had learned, had the capacity to both close a wound and to leave a scar that warns. He'd spared Pete not because he admired him, but because killing the small thieves who sometimes spice a man's life with danger did not straighten the world. He had the grim conviction that a man who must make a choice does not measure the enemy only by the immediate harm, but by the future of his own soul. The town folded them in. Uncle Elias came by to drink coffee at the shop and to fuss over the children until they were embarrassed and in need of the stable air. Yates and Margaret learned to be the kind of people whose names meant something like steadiness. They held the lost and the small in their doors when the town needed a place for a widow or a child whose parents had gone west. They bought grain cheaply when men speculated and sold it back at cost when men needed to eat. Their life became an accumulation of such small mercies. When the mining boom arrived, a hot, restless surge of men looking for quick coin and quick glory, Jerome swelled and then contracted in the fashion of a beast licking a wound. The town's prosperity rose, and with it the temptation for vice. A fire came one harsh autumn, a house ignited by an overturned lamp, and a wind that smelled of dry wood. The conflagration took 2 shops and the smithy before the town had enough buckets and enough men sober enough to form a line. Yates stood on a ladder with a leather bucket and a fist wrapped around it, flinging water and yelling for men to move where they could help. Margaret ran between the smoke and the street, directing children, carrying blankets, opening their own shop to those who had lost everything. They fed a family that had lost both parents. They took in 3 children whose home had become ash. The following winter, when the smoke had cooled and the town had rebuilt itself from the generosity of its inhabitants, there was a small wooden plaque over the entry to the chapel where men came to give thanks. It read simply, "For those who would not look away." It was not a thing Margaret and Yates had sought. It was the town's way of naming the work they had done. Time does not stop to honor anyone. It kept going, the years passing like logs downriver. William grew into his father's hands, careful, strong, able to start a team and to sit long at a plow. Elizabeth had a mother's steadiness and a stubbornness that made her into a teacher who would stay in Jerome and teach children how to read by the light of small lamps. James, youngest and quick of foot, took to the saddle the way a bird takes to air. Old age came as it will, quietly at first. Yates's hair took on gray at the temple, a quiet constellation that matched the gray that had been in Margaret's eyes since the winter when they had met. They moved more slowly, the way a man and woman who have kept many small promises might find time bending them toward rest. They sat on a porch that faced the western sky, Yates with his hand on a cane he used more for habit than necessity, and Margaret with the locket at her throat still, dulled but unbroken. One summer night, long after the town's bell had been rung, and the streets were empty save for the occasional carriage returning from a long day's work, the 2 of them sat under a sky that spread wide and full of stars. It was the kind of night that makes a man look back like a cart has turned its contents around for inspection. "Do you ever wonder," Margaret asked, her voice soft with the years, "what would have happened if you hadn't found me in the drift?" Yates looked at her with the look he'd always had when speaking of things that mattered, a patience like a fence post, upright and unafraid. "Could have been dead," he said, and then let a small grin lift his mouth. "Could have been some other woman or some other trouble, but I found you. That's the part that counts." She reached for his hand. His fingers closed over hers, as if remembering the feel of stitches and the press of bread dough and the warmth of a child's forehead. "You could have kept going," she said. "You didn't have to stop." "No," he replied simply. "I stopped because I could not let you die there. There are small votes a man can make about how he'll live. That was one." They sat in silence long enough for the stars to have their say. The porch creaked. In the distance, the chorus of the town settled into a night rhythm. Yates's voice finally came, low and sure, carrying the kind of certainty that had once been born in cold nights on an open ridge. "There are 100 ways to punish the world," he said. "I don't think killing is the best one. Mercy keeps a man's hands from being too full." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder and let the weight of a life rest against him. "We made a town better," she said, not as boast, but as fact. Their life had been a series of small corrections, a stitch here, a loaf there, a child's education, a refuge during a fire, and those small actions multiplied over decades made a town kinder than it had been. He thought of the cabinet where he'd kept his mapping tools long ago, and of the simple, unadorned ways in which a life could be measured, by the number of beds a man had warmed, by the number of meals he had helped prepare, by a locket returned in the hands that had guarded it. "It started with not looking away," he said. "That was the first vote." "One man refused to look away," Margaret said, the words fitting the cadence of their history. "One action changed many lives." They sat until the chill made their shoulders draw close. When the children were grown, and the nights long and the town quiet, Margaret would sometimes wake and touch the locket, and remember the iron-stained snow, and the breath that had been as small as a moth, and she would feel gratitude like a steady coin in her palm. When at last they were too old for the shop, and too tired for the chores that had once formed their bodies, they moved into a small house closer to the center of Jerome. The shop passed to William, who kept his father's steady prudence and his mother's gentle temper. Elizabeth took the school and made it a place where children learned reading and how to make a bed tight against the cold. James stayed home to help with the livestock. The town continued as towns will, full of small human dramas and the odd grand ones that come with fire, flood, or fortune. Years later, when the children had children of their own, and the once bright lashes of youth had dulled into the lines that mock a life, there came a storm. It was not one that would sweep a house from its foundation, but it was the sort of event where a town remembers who its friends are. A winter fire in a neighboring homestead left a family without shelter. The town gathered blankets and food. Margaret and Yates opened their door again without hesitation. The act was habitual by then, an almost reflexive generosity grown in a life where they had been given so much. On a day when the light was thin and the town was washed in the grey that precedes snow, the three children, William, Elizabeth, and James, stood at the foot of their parents' porch, watching the couple whose story they knew as if it were scripture. They held their own children close, the generations folding like pages. The children listened when Yates told once more the story of finding a woman in the drift. When he finished, there was a small silence, the sort of silence that means a lesson had been taught without blare. "A good life is mostly small things," Yates said, and his voice carried through the cold. "You stitch, you feed, you do not look away when someone needs you. The rest is luck." They had their share of luck, but they had also made their luck by the steady, stubborn forms of mercy. The town remembered them not in monuments, but in habits. Shops that opened their doors to the cold, a school that took in a child who had none, a small fund set aside by the council for those who had lost more than coin. The plaque over the chapel remained, its wood softened by seasons, its letters clear. For those who would not look away. When their hair was as white as the drift that had once almost claimed Margaret, they would sit beneath the pines where the graves of two men lay, graves that had been dug with shovels handled by hands that understood both the ease of taking and the harder work of burying. They had never forgotten the men who had come to their cabin. The violence had left marks in memory. It had also taught them how fragile life was, and how the small acts of mercy echo. On his last clear night, Yates walked the ridge with thunder led by his reins, Margaret's hand in his. The sky was a cup turned silver with stars. He had been a mountain man, a scout, a shopkeeper, a husband and father, and the kind of neighbor people come to when they need to borrow sugar. He had been many things that a boy would not have guessed from the look of his rifle or the set of his jaw. He stopped by the drift where he had found her years before. Snow no longer lay here except as a memory, and a line of grass where the wind had shaped the earth. He knelt on the ground and found a stone that had been warmed by sun, and set it by the way one marks a place by a small private sign. "Remember," he said to the night, to the place, to the woman beyond the ridge who had been his future before he knew such things. "You did the right thing." Margaret touched his shoulder with a hand worn by stitches, bread, and the years of holding children at night. "You stopped," she said, and in that sentence was the whole of why she had not died in a drift where the world had asked no questions. "You didn't look away." They grew old together, as some people do, their story quietly threaded into the town's own. When Yates died, the town gathered as it would for a man who had been both neighbor and hero without wanting to play a hero's part. They carried him to a place beneath the pines. Margaret stood with the locket against her heart and thought of the rimed frost and the breath that had been a moth. She was not young then, but something of the small girl who had lost a locket and found a future returned in the curve of memory. She lived on, surrounded by familiar faces and by the small tasks that kept a mind sharp. Baking, sewing, reading to children who liked the sound of a voice shaped by the world. In the long afternoons, she would sit by the window and watch the place where men once had taken a stagecoach and been made into robbers and thieves. The town had grown, but it had also kept its smallness, the same stores, the same lane where a child might tie his sled. The generations that followed knew the story of how Margaret had been found in the snow and of how a cowboy had carried her to life. They told it at harvest suppers and at town meetings, and in the quiet of a winter's evening when the fire burned low. When Margaret died, it was not a sudden snatch, but the slow folding of a life that had been lived full. People came, neighbors, descendants, the ones who had been held in the wake of her and Yates's mercy. The chapel was full. The preacher, an old man with a slow voice, spoke of the smallness of courage and of duty. The town spoke as towns do, through service more than speech. They loaded the cart with blankets and bread and sent the goods to a farm twinned to misfortune, for that was what those who remembered her life would do. At the graveside, beneath the pines that had kept watch since before Yates had knelt to mark the first stone, William placed the locket in his mother's hands and then set it in her coffin. He did not keep it to himself. He put it back in the world she had made, small, pliant, given. It felt right to close the circle where a lost token had begun a life. The wind moved through the trees like an old sigh, and the sun made the snow, when it was there, into a dull, obliging light. Years afterward, when children who had only heard the tale as a bedtime story asked at school who had done the right thing, the teacher would say that the world sometimes asked you to make a small but decisive choice, to stop and do the hard thing instead of passing by. The line was simple. It was the lesson they had learned from two people who had made their life into a practice of such small mercies. In the end, the ridge remained, the pines kept their watch. The cabin no longer stood, but where it had been, a small marker read, "Here a life was saved." The words were spare because the life they named was not a sermon, but an honest record. One man had refused to look away, and a woman who should have died had walked into a future that would have children and bread, and a town that knew better than to let a neighbor go without help. The world continued, flawed and human, but those who traced the story saw how a single mercy can tilt the arc of many lives. It was not a miracle, the old people would say. It was a choice, and choices are the currency people leave behind. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes small acts still have the power to change the world.